Hello. Crime, the cost of crime, the fear of crime. We all talk about crime, but as someone once said about the weather, no one actually does anything about it. Punishment doesn't seem to work. If locking people up solved crime, Britain would be the most law-abiding nation in Europe. As for understanding the roots of crime, the field has been dominated by the softer sciences of sociology and psychology. But now, according to two programmes broadcast by Channel 4 in its Battered Britain series, the science of biology is staking a claim. There are growing clinical clues that there is a distinctive criminal brain, and evidence that we should think of crime not as a social plague, but as an individual illness. Many scientists are convinced that the brains of persistent criminals are different from ordinary law-abiding people.
The recidivists we've studied over the years, the probability is probably over 90% that he has an abnormality of his brain.
The thinking part of the brain is the frontal cortex, where important incoming messages from the nervous system are analysed and acted upon. Our emotions are generated here in the limbic system, the seat of our instinctive, irrational or impulsive behaviour. In normal people, the cortex keeps the limbic system in check to make us feel and react in socially acceptable ways. By measuring the amount of electrical activity in the brain, scientists can tell when this normally self-controlling mechanism is defective. They call this condition low arousal.
The last 50 years we've been finding that criminals or antisocial individuals tend to evidence low arousal.
In an under-aroused brain, the internal communication system isn't working properly. This, the experts say, can predispose a person to antisocial or criminal behaviour. But why? One reason is their brains crave excitement.
When I'd done the bullying robbery, it was the thrill of it. I would say more so than the money.
Another reason is the brain simply fails to control its natural urges.
We have urges, a gas pedal go system, and we have a braking system to put the brakes on, the inhibition. And what most of these recidivists appear to lack is the braking system.
Modern brain imaging techniques give a totally new vision of which parts of the brain are working and which are not.
Compare this scan of the normal individual to this scan of a murderer. The striking thing about this scan is that there's a distinct lack of prefrontal activation within this impulsive murderer. That's exactly what you would expect.
Well, with me to discuss the implications of these new scientific claims and indeed their validity, we have Adrian Raine, Professor of Psychology at the University of Southern California, a man who studied the psychopathology, that is, the physical functioning of the brain of violent prisoners. Brina Satterfield is a psychotherapist who specialises in a revolutionary treatment for potentially delinquent children. Her successful treatment blends traditional psychotherapeutic approaches with the emerging new science. Stephen Rose is a professor of biology at the Open University, and it's fair to say he hasn't much time for biological theories of crime, believing that they detract from the social and political agenda. Joe Whitty is certainly entitled to his own theories on the basis of having spent 34 years in the company of criminals in the prison service, where he ended up as one of Britain's most imaginative and respected prison governors. Alan Levy, QC, specialises in children's and medical law, so we'll be looking to him to set our new knowledge in a legal context. If crime is a disorder, can it be any more illegal than, say, schizophrenia? Mike O'Brien is a Labour MP representing a party which is famously tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. We'll see how curious or convinced he is about the biological causes, and doubtless he'll report back to the Police Federation, whose parliamentary advisor he is. Stephen Rose, can I begin with you first? Do you believe there is any significant biological basis to crime?
Well, look, all of us have brains, and how we behave is dependent on our brains. But what depressed me about this film, and I say this as someone who works on the brain, I'm a neuroscientist, is I thought it was highly irresponsible. What you get is an expression of apparent complete certainty on the part of a rather bland voiceover speaker saying scientists have shown this, scientists have shown that. These are areas of enormous controversy within the scientific area, and none of that is shown in the film at all. We get parts of the film which look as if they're an advertising film for a pharmaceutical company which produces a distinctly dubious and in some ways rather dangerous drug, Ritalin, used much in the States and not in this country. And above all, we get Dr. Raine. Dr. Raine standing in front front of brain scans and making extraordinary statements about this is the brain of a murderer and this is the brain of a common person. Now, Dr. Rain, you're not trained as a neuroscientist, and I have to tell you that I don't think any neuroscientist would actually be prepared to stand in front of scans of that sort, which you must know are highly massaged, highly dealt with data before it comes like that, and make such generalizations. Your controls don't make sense. I would like to know, for example, how you're prepared to say that this is the brain of a murderer and you don't have a control of financier, a finance criminal, a judge, a lawyer, a politician. What are your normals that you're controlling this against? And above all, what depresses me is the crude and old-fashioned view of the relationship between different parts of the brain, which make it sound, I mean, that idea of the frontal cortex and the limbic system went out really 40 years ago, and you really ought to have had a better brain scientist giving you advice on this.
Let's go to Adrian Rain. You've got something to answer there.
Sure. Well, the truth is that the two documentary programs could not, of course, document the many hundreds of studies that have clearly demonstrated a biological basis to crime. What they've only done is just scratched the surface and illustrated them with a few interesting studies. But there are many, many good scientists in the United States and this country too who've clearly demonstrated a biological basis, just a basis of predisposition to violence. That is really indisputable scientifically. The big question is, how do we fit these new biological data into the bigger picture, where the bigger picture involves the social environment, parents, schools, the streets. That's really the critical question.
Steve, let me ask you, do you not believe that PET scans, this insight into the brain, can tell us anything about brain function?
PET scans are the most marvellous windows into the brain. They have to be used with enormous care, and neuroscientists do, because they know how complex it is to interpret that data, and to make that sort of generalisation wouldn't be accepted.
Adrian.
I am trained in the physiology of human behaviour. And all of the studies that we've done over the 17 years have been very carefully reviewed in peer-reviewed, high-quality journals. That study that you referred to, the brain imaging study, was published in a high-quality physiological journal. So if it was an outrageous study of the type that you're mentioning, it would have been thrown out, very quickly.
I'm not sure that it would, Adrian, and I'm not sure that it would because there's a huge investment in the States at the moment on precisely this sort of biologizing claims.
But what about the question of those murderers, though? I mean, is it a valid thing to do to show, here is a picture of a murderer?
Yes, it is. I think it's important to look at the brain correlates of people who commit violence and those that don't. Now, we don't want to say at all that just because you have a brain scan which looks like a murderer, that's not going to make you a murderer. There are many murderers with normal brain scans, many normal people with abnormal brain scans.
So how does that help us?
It helps us in the fact that we're taking one step towards a later solution. For example, it's quite true that no study today, tomorrow, or in the next week is going to solve the problem of what is the biological basis to crime. But we need to begin along that line. We need some initial studies to go there. The brain imaging study which I conducted is the first one of its type. It has flaws, as do all studies which are first in the field. Nevertheless, we will get better and bigger studies which I think will demonstrate that brains of violent offenders do differ to those of normals.
We'll come back to the argument.
I just want to ask what you mean by normal.
I just want to bring in Brina Satterfield at this point.
Let's understand about what's meant by normal. That is an important question.
Can we come back to that a little bit later? I'd like to bring in Brina at this moment. What is your view of this contradiction that you see in front of you?
Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm a psychotherapist. And that's a little bit different. Children are brought in with symptoms and problems. I happen to be married to a scientist who did do brain research and who did have age-matched normal controls and who followed children, both hyperactive children, attention deficit disordered children more properly, and the normal controls.
I suppose what I'm asking is, is it the counselling or the chemistry that is making the difference now?
Darned if I know. We use a multimodality treatment. The treatment includes counseling for parents, training for parents, group therapy for children, family therapy, individual therapy for children, behavior modification, and medication, all as a combined treatment. So it's very hard to tease it apart and say, this is the precise thing that made the difference.
But biology plays a part, you feel?
Biology plays a part, I think. Yes, especially when you see it running in families. I've seen families with a father and a grandfather and a child all sitting there with the grandfather saying, I was just like that. And the father is saying, yes, and I was just like that. And there's the child. And they're worried about him. And so, yes, I think biology plays a part.
Joe, you've got more experience of offending and delinquency than any of us here will put together. Did the programmes tell you anything? Did they strike any chord for you?
Very much so. And indeed, I found it, as a layperson, a very exciting concept for us to hopefully go away and explore a little more in this country. And again, I would emphasise the point that was made by Dr. Rain, that we're talking about a very small proportion of people, and by definition, an even smaller proportion of the prison population or the young offender population. But having said that, I have lived for many, many years with people who I identify in the same way that is identified by Brina and also by Dr. Rain. These are people who within the prison population are significantly different in their response both to any type of treatment method, any type of control method. They actually stick out from the rest of the prison population. It's a small proportion. They make a tremendous control problem for us. And one of the greatest problems that we have in terms of controlling prisons is that these people will often determine what is allowed to happen. Through their almost predatory nature, they will then bully other people. They will cause tremendous problems.
And do they make more sense to you now that you've seen the programmes?
Well, I personally, it confirms much of what my thinking has been over the years. I, for example, know that many people who are in prison, who are removed from any external source, particularly a chemical source, they often settle down in prison and are perfectly happy as you can be. And some of these are people who are doing maybe 10, 15, 20, 25 years. As soon as they get onto perhaps illicit drugs, they get onto illicit drink, or any other sort of chemical compounds, then you see the nature of that person change.
An obvious chemical interaction. Mike, let me ask you. There is a feeling, and perhaps it comes a little bit from Stephen as well, that this science is somehow right-wing. It places the onus on the individual. It's his responsibility that he's got something wrong with his brain, rather than on society, whereas it's society's business to put these matters right. Do you share that agenda?
Well, society has to deal with crime. And what we have to do is ensure that society is protected from those who may offend against it. Now, in order to protect it, you can deal with it in two ways. One, you lock someone up and you keep them out of interaction with the rest of society, or you try to treat them. What this programme does, I think I'm a little bit more sceptical of it than Joe is. It raised some interesting points. I was sceptical about the way in which it put one side of the argument only, and I'm glad we've heard the other side of the argument here. It was interesting, but I think, as Professor Rain has said, it's the start of an interesting idea. A lot more work needs to be done on it before we can say that, from a policy point of view, we ought to do anything or reach any particular conclusions.
Alan, did any of this, of the science, strike any chords with you?
Yes. May I say I fall into the sceptics camp, although I think not being able to enter into the technical nuances, I'm perhaps a restrained sceptic. But yes, it did, particularly in respect of children. When I practiced in the criminal courts, when I began at the bar for a number of years, one certainly had cases of when one was acting for a child and you would see certain characteristics, for instance, torturing animals, hyperactive behaviour, when even though as a layperson one couldn't help but think that in the future something terrible was going to happen. And indeed in one case, I looked in the newspaper some years later, I'd retained the name of the person I represented to find that he had in fact committed a murder. So it certainly, there was a personal chord. But as to the main theme of the programme, I'm glad to hear Professor Rain say that it's one step along the way to a solution. I mean, that may be ambitious, I hope it isn't. It's to a possible solution. But I do think that I agree with Stephen Rose that the tone of the programme and the hyperbole was very much, in my view, over the top. I almost expected at the end of the programme to hear that a Nobel Prize had been awarded. But in fact, when one examines the material, this is all very speculative, and the evidence, in my view, is very slim, although it may be a hopeful path.
Well, for the moment, a spectrum of opinion on the degree to which biology determines behaviour. But whatever the degree, does the law need to think again about the very notions of guilt, responsibility, punishment? Join us after the break.